Thank you, Rhonda. It is good to be with you this morning. There we go. All right. So we met our freshman year of college, and we started dating our second semester, our freshman year. We dated through college at the University of Kansas, and we had decided eventually we wanted to get married, but we wanted to wait until we graduated to get married, so we waited 6 days. 6 days after we graduated, we got married, and we went into inner city ministry, and we moved into an inner city community in Denver, Colorado. We bought an old house that was 100 years old, and we started fixing it up. We didn't know what we were doing, which you probably shouldn't buy an old house if you don't know what you're doing, but we did it anyway. And we started working with children and families in our community and with the local churches in our community. And one of the things we discovered pretty quickly working with the kids that we had coming in and out of our house in that neighborhood was that over half of the kids that we worked with on a weekly basis had been touched by foster care at some point in their lives. For some of those kids, they had been in foster care when they were little, and now they were back living with grandma, who was just trying to figure things out and make it work. For others, they were in a group home that was a couple blocks away, and still others, a couple doors down, there's a little boy who ended up having to go into care while we knew him. And so that heart that we had, we were both social work majors in college, and the heart that we had for foster care extended back, but it really cemented during this time. And so we decided to become foster parents back in 2000. And anybody here has ever gone through the foster care adoption process, you might have heard that there's a little bit of paperwork involved in that. And so we filled out the paperwork. One of the pieces of paper that you fill out, or that we filled out back then when we did it, was a piece of paper that listed all of the different things that a child might have experienced or conditions they might have. And then you have to make a decision. There's 3 columns. So it's yes, no, or might consider. Would you be willing to take a child into your home who has a hearing impairment? Yes, no, might consider. Would you be willing to take a child into your home that has a heart condition? Yes, no, might consider. A whole list of things about abuse they might have suffered or any of these kinds of things, but you had to say yes, no, or might consider. I don't remember all the things we checked on that form, but there's a couple things that I'm pretty certain of. One, we would have said, because we were 25 and 26 years old at the time, we had no idea what we're doing. You see a theme here with the house and with it, and no idea what we're doing. So we're like, one at a time. No sibling groups, one at a time. That seems reasonable. And secondly, we would not have checked yes or even might consider on major medical needs. Because for us, we were like, surely there are people that are foster parents. Surely there's enough foster parents who have like medical backgrounds, nurses and physical therapists and things. They wouldn't want us to do this, right? And so then we get a call from our social worker, and she says, well, there's these preemie twins in the hospital. And they've been there 3 months. They were born 10 weeks premature. One of them had open heart surgery at 11 days old and almost died. They will be on oxygen for up to 18 months. And they might have cerebral palsy, but we won't know that until they're 2 years old. What do you think? Well, I think you didn't read my paperwork. But she did something that most of the time social workers do not do. Usually when you get that kind of call, you have to say yes or no, and you don't know anything else. She said, well, before you say yes, you can come down to the hospital and meet them before you make that decision. And so my wife, being the most compassionate person I have ever met on the face of the planet, said, well, let's just go down and meet them. They said we didn't have to say yes. You already know how the story ends. I could just sit down. And so we went down to University Hospital. Now, the thing to know about me is I grew up in a small farming community in the middle of Kansas, about 1,200 people. And we were living in the downtown of a major metropolitan area. And so even things like a major university hospital in a city like that was overwhelming to me, not to mention going up to the neonatal intensive care unit in that hospital and walking through this unit. I've never been in anything like that in my life, and walking through that unit, seeing baby after baby, and incubator after incubator with tubes and cords running everywhere. And it got to the end of that unit, we had walked from the smallest babies through the unit all the way to the biggest babies in the unit, and at the very end, there was some glass doors and this separate room, and there was a giant steel crib in there. And these 2 babies were laying in there with tubes and cords running everywhere. And by neonatal intensive care standards, they were giants. They had been there 3 months. They were a whopping 5 pounds. They were born under 2 pounds, but they were a whopping 5 pounds. And I look over the edge of that crib, and I'm thinking, I do not have what it takes to do this. Now, fellas, I can't speak for the women here, but I think I can speak for most guys in here. We grow up asking ourselves the question, do we have what it takes, right? Do I have what it takes to jump across this creek without getting wet? Do I have what it takes to ride on my buddy's handlebars without breaking my head open? Do I have what it takes to jump off this barn roof with a trash bag as a parachute? Do I have what it takes? But looking over the edge of the crib that day, I was certain I did not. I did not have what it takes. But as we prayed about it that day, as we learned about their care, God made something very clear to me and spoke to me in a way that he hasn't spoken to me a lot before or since. And it wasn't an audible voice, but it was this very real sense of, it doesn't matter whether you feel like you have what it takes. If I've called you to do something, I'll equip you to do it. And so we said yes, and we told the hospital staff yes. We said, when does this happen? And they said, oh, how about today? And we said, how about not today? How about you teach us how to keep these babies alive before you send them home with us? And so they said, okay, how about tomorrow? And so we stayed there. We learned all of this stuff, and we went to Babies R Us to get a double stroller because, you know, you might be surprised, but we didn't have a double stroller. We didn't even, and so they had one, but they didn't have it in stock. And so then we had to call our friends who we worked with and said, hey, can you pick up this Babies R Us stroller on your side of town and bring it to us? So they brought it to us, and we went on our way to the hospital. I stopped at a Domino's Pizza to get something to eat, and I put together the stroller in the parking lot of the Domino's Pizza, and we showed up, and we got these babies with their oxygen tanks and their tubes and their cords. And this picture is them on the day that we brought them home in the brand new Babies R Us stroller, which I'd like to note is very well constructed, very well put together. And we got in the van at the University Hospital in the parking garage, and the machines started beeping, and we looked at each other and we're like, well, do we take them back? Like, what do we do? What do we do? But we took them home. Here's them a few months later. And those are, that particular case, it went 3.5 years, but it ended in adoption, and we adopted them. They did not end up having cerebral palsy. And then I want to show you a picture of them plus the rest of my family. So we ended up fostering for 10 years. We adopted 5 of the kids that came to us, and I'd like to introduce you to them. This is me and my wife, and then the twins are coming up next, and then Mariah, bottom row, who's now 21. The twins are now 25, and then Josh, 17, and Sophia, 16. So that's my crew. So I mentioned earlier, and we can go to that next slide. I mentioned earlier that I grew up in a small farming town in Kansas. And when I was about 15, probably, my best friend's dad, he came to me and said, asked me if I wanted a job, asked me if I wanted to drive a wheat truck for him during harvest. Now, there are 2 qualifications for driving a wheat truck. You have to have a driver's license, and you have to know how to drive a stick shift. I was exactly 50% qualified for this job. And so he said, it's all right, I'll teach you to drive stick shift. And so a few days before harvest, he takes me out in this very, you go to this next slide, this very 1950 Chevy wheat truck. Now, y'all, I know I've got some gray hair. To some of you younger ones in this room, I look real old, and I get it. But let me just tell you, even when I was a teenager, that was still a super old truck, okay? 1950 was a long time ago. And so he took me out, and he taught me to drive stick shift on dirt roads in Kansas. And so I started the job, and fairly soon after starting, now here's the idea behind driving a wheat truck, if you haven't been around it or done that before, is you're out in the field, the combine cuts the wheat and sifts it out into grains, and then through a chute, dumps it into the back of your wheat truck, and then I've got to take the wheat truck to the grain elevator and dump it out there, right? And so I'm driving down the road in this truck I barely know how to drive in the middle of Kansas, and I've got all of this wheat in the back of my truck. And after a couple of visits to the grain elevator, it becomes very clear to me just the value of what's in the back of my truck, because I'm getting the receipts, and I'm realizing that a major part of this man's family's livelihood is riding in the back of this truck that I barely know how to drive. And so that makes me a little nervous and makes me a little scared. You can go to the next slide. So driving down these dirt roads, I came to know the value of the harvest and how important it was to this man and his family. So grain elevators. You can go to the next slide. These are the skyscrapers of Kansas. They basically look like paper towel tubes stood up on end next to each other. And so the idea here is you drive up to the grain elevator, and there's a big garage door. You can barely see it here at the bottom, but it's basically a big garage door, and you drive in the parking lot up this ramp into the garage door, and you dump out the wheat into the floor. There's a grate on the floor, and the wheat goes down in there, and then it goes and it gets taken up into the elevator, and then there's a couple more steps, and then you have Wheaties, right? So this is basically how it works. So we are, I go to the grain elevator, and here's the deal. When I'm driving down the road with this load of wheat in my truck, and I look at the grain elevator parking lot, and there's nobody in line waiting to get in the grain elevator, I just relax a little, and I sigh a huge sigh of relief. But when I'm driving down the road and I have a load full of wheat, and I look in the parking lot, and I see a line of trucks waiting to get in the elevator, I die just a little bit inside. So 15-year-old me, I have a mullet down to my shoulder blades, business up front, party in the back, got my ball cap pulled down, and so when there's no line, I can just pull in the parking lot. I can just drive right up the ramp into there, dump my wheat, and I'm on my way. But when there's a line, I've got to sit in line behind those trucks. And eventually, I'm going to end up on that ramp with a line of trucks behind me. And I've got to figure out how to get this relic into gear with a stick shift without backing into the guy behind me. And I am terrified. Some of you younger folks have never driven you have no idea what I'm talking about. Just trust me. It's terrifying. You got to push two pedals at once and let off one just right, or you stall the truck, or you back into somebody. Just stay away from stick shifts, all right? So here's the deal. So I'm terrified when I go up, and I kill the truck several times on my visits there, and I almost back into people. Eventually, the guys at the elevator, they see me. They notice me. And they went to the side, and there was some railroad ties out to the side. And they picked up a railroad tie, and they put it behind the back tires of my truck so that I could get up in there without putting anybody's life in danger. And every time they saw a mullet boy coming through the parking lot, they knew that was their cue, go get the railroad tie. So I don't know, I'm guessing that everyone in here may know what it's like to have somebody see you, see where you're at, and have compassion on you and meet you right where you are. And there is nothing quite like having someone see you in the midst of your struggle and then meeting you where you are with care and kindness. Because the reality is, we cannot care for those we cannot see. We cannot care for those we cannot see. The only reason they were able to do that is because they had the eyes to see me. They were paying attention. Now, I believe most of us in this room are willing to meet needs when we see them. I believe that if a need popped up in front of you right now or today, you would be willing to meet that need. The problem is I think it's become increasingly difficult in our culture to see those needs. We spend a lot of time and energy trying to insulate ourselves from the needs of the world. It makes us uncomfortable when we encounter people in need sometimes because, honestly, the truth is, it's not because we don't like them, it's because we just don't know what to do. And we're afraid of doing the wrong thing or not doing it right. And so we'd rather not be uncomfortable, so we separate ourselves. We don't go to those neighborhoods. We don't move into those places because it's just easier to be in a place where you don't have to feel that discomfort. Sometimes it's because we're busy or it seems far away. There's a big distance, right? But the reality does not change that we cannot care for those we cannot see. So today, we're going to look at a chapter in the Old Testament. And I know you guys have been in the book of Romans, and you're in Romans 11, in that neighborhood, and that big theme of that is that about his mercies enduring through generation after generation after generation. And what we're going to talk about today is very much like that. We're going to talk about the mercy of God and how it has existed, and we're going to go back a lot of generations, and to talk about how the God that we serve, the God that shows us mercy, is the same God that was showing mercy back then, and what that means for us today. So there's a lot of people, when you talk about with them, largely outside of the church, about the Old and the New Testament, they might say something like, well, I can get behind the God of the New Testament, but I'm not so sure about the God of the Old Testament. I like Jesus because he seems nice, but the God that I see in the Old Testament is different than that. And they make this distinction, but I want to talk about that and talk about, well, what is actually true of the God of the Old Testament? And is he different from what we read in the New Testament? So we're going to be in the book of Deuteronomy, and a lot of people in here spending a lot of time in your quiet time in Deuteronomy these days. Yeah, probably not. All right, that's fine. Deuteronomy is largely a list of laws for the nation of Israel. And to be quite honest, when you start reading through those and you compare them to our laws today, it can feel weird. Like some of the laws, you're like, that's weird. Why do they have a law about that? Like, that's just weird. And it makes us feel strange and uncomfortable. But a better thing to do than trying to compare ancient laws with modern laws is to compare ancient laws to ancient laws. So let's compare, what if we compared the ancient laws of Israel to the ancient laws of the Assyrians or the Babylonians? That's more helpful. It's more helpful to understand the difference between what the God of the Israelites wanted for them and what the Babylonians and the Assyrians who did not know God were, the codes that they were living by, right? And one of the main differences we see in that difference is that in Assyrian and Babylonian law, the laws were structured to favor the wealthy, to favor the influential. They were set up so that you got a different set of justice if you had means. But it was very different in the laws given to Israel. It was actually set up to favor the poor, to favor the vulnerable, to favor the oppressed. Laws were set up to make sure that we saw the vulnerable, because we cannot care for those we cannot see. So I want to read a couple of passages just to set that context, and then we'll get into our main passage for today. But the first is in Deuteronomy 24 verses 10 through 13. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. So basically, I'm going to loan somebody some money, and I'm going to take some collateral, something that he owns, so that if he doesn't pay me back, I get to keep whatever he gave me, right? And then it goes on a little later in that passage to say, and if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. So in other words, this is an instance where you give him a loan, and he gives you his coat or his cloak. And if he's a poor man, you shall not sleep in his coat. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets. So if he hasn't paid you back by the end of the day, you got to take him his coat back because he's going to be cold. And you shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. Now that's inconvenient. I've loaned somebody some money. They've given me a coat. Now I got to go back to their house and I got to give them their coat. Then I got to come back in the morning and I got to pick up their coat again. And I got to hold it in pledge. And then I got to go back the next night, for as long as it takes this guy. But God built into the laws for Israel these things to make sure that the poor were seen and cared for. Because when he writes these, you're like, oh yeah, I didn't even realize, I didn't even think about the fact that I have 3 coats in the closet. It wouldn't have even dawned on me that this might be the only thing warm that he has. And that's the problem, right? And that's the problem we find ourselves in, even in our culture. Here's another one, Deuteronomy 24:14-15. You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. You got to pay him on the same day. And if you've been in the workforce a while and you've made good financial decisions and you have a little money in the bank, if your paycheck comes late, you're fine for a few days. I don't know if any of you have ever been, when we were first married, we had this very thing happen to us. We were working for a friend of ours' dad, and he didn't do anything wrong, but we were literally counting on the money we were going to get paid on Friday. We were doing a little side work for him when we were first married to eat that weekend. We were broke as a joke when we got married. And he just forgot and just thought, well, I'll just pay him on Monday. It'll be fine. Now, God provided for us, and we saw him do that so many times when we were in those situations. But it's hard to see things like he didn't see it, and it's not his fault necessarily, but he didn't see it. And so that's where we find ourselves a lot of times is we don't meet people where they are because we just didn't see it. We just didn't see them where they were. So this is our passage for today. We'll show it up here. Deuteronomy 24:19-22. So taking those couple of passages in context, here's what this passage says. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterwards. The vines, you should not strip them afterwards. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this. So part of seeing is understanding where you came from. You were a slave. For me, I was that worker who didn't know what I was going to eat that weekend, right? It goes back. We got to remember back to what it was like when we didn't know Christ. And we have to see people where they are. Now, at this time, God's expectation was that when you harvested your crops, whether it was wheat or grapes or olives, that you would tithe from what you harvested. But in addition to that, it wasn't just about the tithe. In addition to that, they were expected to leave part of their harvest in the field. Like, don't be super picky about making sure you get every grape or making sure you get every sheaf in the field. Do what you can, but leave some behind. And then from what you take, then I'm asking you to tithe from that. But even in addition to that, leave something in the field for the most vulnerable among you. Again, not so much, I don't think, an instruction about financial management as instruction about what you're paying attention to. Because if that command isn't there, you might not even notice that there are people wandering on the countryside looking for something to eat. But God reminds you that there is, and so you probably should do something about that. Setting aside part of who we are and what we do for the vulnerable begins with seeing the vulnerable and the realities they face, because we cannot care for those we do not see. These laws that cared for oppressed people, like I mentioned before, the Babylonians and the Assyrians didn't have laws like that. They protected the wealthy and the rich. These laws, they set Israel apart. It made them different from the surrounding nations. And we see this theme go through the New Testament when we look at James 1:27, that religion our God and Father accepts as pure and faultless as this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. A lot of times people in our space, in Rhonda and I's space, we camp out on the first part of that verse. Oh, see, it says, look after orphans and widows in their distress. But maybe we don't emphasize as much the second half of that verse, was, and keep yourself from being polluted by the world. Those things go hand in hand. There's this idea of being both helpful, and as my friend Jason Johnson says that I work with, being helpful and holy. And in ancient Israel, when they obeyed these passages, they were doing both. In the very act of being helpful, of caring for the poor, they were setting themselves apart from the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and that was making them holy. That's what holy means. So in the very act of being helpful, they were achieving some degree of holiness, some degree of set-apartness. Now, the good news for you and the good news for me is that God is not asking us to give something we don't have to give. He is not asking something of us that is unreasonable. He didn't expect the grain farmer to leave grapes. He didn't expect the grape farmer to leave figs or olives or whatever. He expects all of us to leave behind, to set aside something of our livelihood, something that we're good at, something that we actually have to give for the most vulnerable among us. So, what does this mean for us? What would it look like to come close enough to see, and then to leave a part of who you are and what you do for the vulnerable? What does that look like, not in theory, but what does that look like tomorrow morning on Monday? Well, I want to give you a few examples that I've seen around the country in the work that I get to do of people who've done this. So there's an incredible ministry out on the West Coast in Silicon Valley, up in the San Francisco area. It's called Foster the City. And there is a vibrant group. You know, sometimes we get an idea in our head about what certain parts of the country are like. But I'm telling you, there are brothers and sisters in Christ in that place doing incredible work. Leading people to Jesus and caring for the vulnerable. And there's this ministry there called Foster the City that works with churches to help them to do that. And there are a lot of folks in that community who work for all the tech companies, for all the names that you would have heard of, and they have a certain set of skills that allow them to do incredible things with software. And so at Foster the City, they have this group of developers and software programmers that they're setting aside a portion of what they're good at and who they are as believers in that space to care for the vulnerable. They're helping to set up apps that help mobilize the body of Christ to wrap around adoptive and foster families. They are using the skills that they have, that they make money for the rest of the week, and then they're doing some stuff on the side because they're leaving a portion of their field for the vulnerable. Another example, in Memphis, there's a group of folks working together in that community, and they began to ask questions and figure out what are the biggest gaps that exist in our community. And one of the things they found was transportation was a huge issue. There were these families who wanted to provide for their children so that their children didn't end up in foster care, but they had a really hard time with transportation. Public transportation is not abundant there. And so they began to sniff that out, figure out what can be done. And they found these couple of mechanics. And these mechanics, they would find cars that had been donated, and then these mechanics would spend some of their spare time fixing up those cars and giving them to single moms who are struggling. And so this group of folks, they came around these mechanics and said, hey, let's make that bigger. And so they held a community-wide car show, an event where they gave away 2 cars, but they also got a bunch of other mechanics involved. And now they're working on trying to eventually raise money to build a garage that mechanics in the community can come on their spare time and fix up cars to give to people who need it so that they can keep their kids and love them well. So these mechanics are using a portion of their field. They're setting aside a portion of who they are and what they're good at to care for the vulnerable. I know a guy named Phil. He was an executive leader, started a company when he was young, and it grew to be a huge, influential company. And when he got to be a certain age, he ended up selling the company. He did very well, but even while he was working for that company, he started to become he was a CASA. So all the influence he had, all the people he had working for him, he spent a portion of his time giving it to a child in court who needed somebody to speak up for them. And at CASA, what they do is they learn about a child, and then they represent that child in court and represent that child's best interests. But Phil didn't stop there. So he did that for years. And then when he retired, if you can call it that, he started looking around his community and saying, I mean, this guy's a leader. So he looks around not only his community, but his whole state. And he says, I think if we rallied people together and got them in the same room and started going in the same direction, I think we could make a lot bigger difference for these kids in foster care than we're making right now. So Phil used his executive leader experience to rally people for the vulnerable. So even while he was working, he set aside a portion of his field, and then he retired and said, hey, let's give it the whole field. Let's go. These are examples of people who understood that you cannot care for those you cannot see. And they deliberately put themselves in a position of seeing. So maybe today you're a person, you're sitting there as a teacher, as somebody who's working in software and project management, event planning, any number of things. You might be an executive, you might be in law enforcement. It doesn't matter what it is. I guarantee you there is a place for you to set aside a portion of who you are and what you're good at and what you do for the vulnerable. And it's just a matter of opening your hands and saying, God, help me to see. Help me to see what's around me and how I can use this for the vulnerable in my community. So we can go to that next slide. So I mentioned at the beginning that I became very aware driving that wheat truck how valuable the harvest was. You know, when it was harvest time, you just had a week or so to get the wheat in when it was ripe and ready, and you could not risk a storm rolling in and raining and making the fields too muddy for the combines to get through. So you had to move fast. When the wheat, you didn't want to harvest it too early, but when it was time, it was time. So you didn't roll into town and have a casual lunch during harvest. Lunch was brought out to the field. There wasn't a minute to waste. You'd worked your whole year to get your paycheck during this week. So the harvest was incredibly valuable, and every day was precious, which made this one particular day really stand out to me in my mind. I showed up that day to drive wheat truck for work, and my best friend's dad said, hey, we're not going to be here today. Hop in the truck and follow us. So we grabbed the combines and the wheat trucks that we were using, and we drove, and we eventually ended up at this field that I did not recognize. I did not know exactly where we were. But when we got there were a whole lot of people there, and there were a whole lot of combines, and there were a whole lot of wheat trucks. Some of the stuff that was there were guys with combines there that had, at the time, we had, for younger folks, yes, even when I was a teenager, we had lasers back then. There were laser-guided combine systems that some of those folks had, but then there were also 1950 Chevy wheat trucks that showed up. And here was the deal. There was a guy that owned that field, and he'd gotten very sick. and he was not going to be able to bring in his harvest that year that his family was depending on. And in a town like mine, in a community like the one that I grew up in, when somebody in the community goes down, everybody shows up. Everybody shows up. And so everybody did. And so you've probably seen pictures like this on TV. This is an example of what it looks like when combines pull out, but there are all different kinds of combines pull out, and they stair step like this. And in a harvest that might have taken this farmer maybe a week to bring in, together we brought it in a day. We brought it in a day, and you can go to this next slide. And at the end of the day, food's brought out to the field, and as we're eating dinner, and celebrating, right? That's part of it, celebrating what God can do through the power of unity in the midst of a community. As I think about that day and who would have been there, the faces that would have been there that day, people I knew and people I didn't know, one thing's clear to me. I was absolutely the least qualified person to be in the field that day. No question. I barely knew how to operate the piece of equipment I was in charge of. But somehow, in this economy, in this world, I had a place. And I was needed. And the day wouldn't have been the same if I hadn't been there. As small as my contribution was, and as low as my skills were, I was needed there. And so, no matter who you are, what you do, how insignificant you might feel or how little you feel like you might have to contribute, I guarantee you, we need you. Because we cannot care for those we cannot see. And we need you at the field. I want to end with this. Go to Matthew 9:36 and 37. Skipping forward to Jesus, and this is what he said. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Notice the first three words, when he saw. When he saw the crowds, he saw them. And he had compassion on it. His seeing led to his compassion because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Now, we like to use that verse as exclusively an evangelism verse. Like, hey, we need more workers to go out and share the good news of Jesus. And we do, and that is true. That is very much what Jesus was doing. But it's interesting, if you were to back up in that chapter and look at what Jesus was doing right before he said this, he spent his day caring for the vulnerable. He spent his day healing the sick, caring for the poor. And so when he's asking for more people to help, he's not just asking for people to talk about him. He's asking for more people to go out and show the world that we are holy and set apart, and that we are set apart because of the way that we care, because we see people and then we care for them. And that's my prayer for all of us. That's my prayer for you. And I'm going to pray for you, but before I do, a couple things. One, if you're sitting there and you're wondering, gosh, I wonder what I might be able to do with the gifts I have. What could I set aside to care for the vulnerable? You've got two good options here this morning. You've got three good options. I'll dare to say that. I'm the third one. Talk to me, and I love talking through these things with people, trying to figure out what they can do. But you've got Rhonda, who is well regarded across the country for the work she does in this community. And so talk to her. I know she'd love to talk to you about how you might be able to use your gifts. And if you get by both me and Rhonda, Joe is going to tackle you at the door. So you can get with Joe too, and she would love to do that. You're the outside linebacker for the championship, aren't you? Yeah. So Joe or Rhonda or myself, we'd love to talk to you about how you can put yourself in a position to see and care for those around you. And then one more thing I want to note. If you're here today and listening to this, and you yourself have felt unseen or invisible, I need you to know there is someone who sees you, and he sees everything about you. And you're sitting there maybe thinking, that the things I've done, with the thoughts that go through my head, with the past I've lived, like there's no way. But I'm going to tell you, there is one, and his name is Jesus, and he sees it all. He sees everything you are and everything you've done, both good and bad, but he sees you and he cares for you. And he is opening his arms to you and wants you to come to him. And he will welcome you in because he sees you and he cares for you. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this group of people, for this day, for this time, for your word, for you seeing us and in our need meeting us with your Son. That we were once orphans. We were once set apart and away from you because of our own sin, and you adopted us into your family. And Jesus paid the adoption fee, paid the ransom, so that we could be with you not only in heaven, but be a part of your kingdom as it gets built here on earth. So, Lord, I pray for everybody in this room, you would help us to put ourselves in a position to see, and you would show each person in this room the way in which you want to use them and the gifts they have and the experiences they've had to care for the vulnerable. In Jesus' name, amen.